Usually, when we talk about violence, the picture that immediately jumps into your head is visceral. It's intensely physical.
Right.
You probably picture weapons or, destruction, a physical altercation, a
Yeah.
bodily harm. It's a very tangible reality.
Absolutely.
Because when someone is a victim of physical violence, there's evidence left behind. A bruised arm,
Yeah.
a shattered window.
A jagged white line on an X-ray.
Exactly. There is a clear before and a clear damaged after.
It is an undeniable rupture of the normal state of things. I mean, when physical violence happens, we rarely debate whether an impact just occurred. The damage is right there.
Yeah.
It occupies physical space.
Yeah.
It demands an immediate physical response.
But then you think about words, you think about symbols, or a really catchy slogan on a political poster. You think about an emotional narrative in a video you just scrolled past on your feed while sitting safely in your living room.
Right, which changes the dynamic entirely.
It does. Suddenly, that clear, sharp picture of violence gets incredibly murky. Because nobody gets a physical bruise from reading an article.
No, they don't.
You don't end up in the emergency room because someone showed you a selectively edited photograph. And yet, historically, and right now, words and symbols have this terrifying track record of preceding mass atrocities.
Which is exactly why we're looking at this today.
Yeah, so today we are exploring a really urgent philosophical dilemma for this deep dive. It's anchored by a fascinating source piece titled Question 92, Is Propaganda a Form of Violence?
It's such a provocative question.
It really is. We're unpacking whether words that wound, words that manipulate belong in the exact same moral category as physical weapons, or, if they are simply the tools that set the stage for the destruction.
And that is a question that cuts right to the heart of how we organize societies. We're looking at how communication can systematically prepare entire populations for persecution, for ethnic hatred, for mass violence.
All without a single punch being thrown initially.
Exactly. We have to understand the mechanics of that preparation.
And for you listening right now, navigating an age where we are constantly bathed in information, you have a supercomputer in your pocket feeding you narratives every waking second.
It never stops.
Never. So understanding the hidden mechanics of persuasion isn't just theory. It is a vital, everyday survival skill for protecting your own independent thought. Because if you cannot see the machinery working on you, you cannot defend against it.
Well said. But to even begin to judge whether propaganda constitutes a form of violence, we have to do some groundwork first.
Okay, where do we start?
We need to strip away our casual, everyday assumptions about what the word propaganda actually means. Because most of us use that word very imprecisely. It's almost a reflex at this point.
Yeah, I think if you ask the average person on the street what is propaganda, they're going to say, oh, it's a bunch of lies told by the government. Or they might just say, it's the biased information that the other political side believes, which I know to be false. It's almost always equated with just outright deception.
And that is the very first misconception we need to dismantle. Propaganda is not simply information we disagree with. And crucially, it is not always built on outright lies.
Wait, really? It doesn't have to be a lie.
No, not at all. Based on the framework we are exploring, propaganda is communication designed to shape attitudes or behavior by selectively presenting information, emotion, symbols, or narratives. And it does this to advance a specific goal.
Whether that goal is political, ideological, institutional.
Exactly. It can involve exaggeration, sure. It can involve the omission of inconvenient facts. But the most effective propaganda often contains many, many true statements.
Okay, I have to push back on this idea that truth can be propaganda.
Go for it.
Because if a piece of media is telling the truth, if the facts in it are actually verifiable, historical, and correct, how can it be dangerous? If I'm a journalist or a politician and I'm literally just telling you things that actually happened, calling that propaganda just feels like a way to shut down inconvenient facts.
Oh, that's a really fair point.
Yeah.
But we have to distinguish between telling the truth and telling a truth.
Okay, unpack that for me.
When you selectively present only the facts that trigger fear, or, only the facts that make a specific group look dangerous, while actively omitting all the context that would calm the situation down, you are weaponizing those facts.
Oh, I see.
You are using truth as an instrument of manipulation. The facts are accurate, but the picture they paint, when isolated from the broader reality, is entirely engineered.
Okay, so it's like a lawyer presenting a case to a jury. Let's say I'm a prosecutor, right?
Sure.
And my goal is to put the defendant in jail. I show the jury that the defendant was at the scene of the crime. I show them that the defendant owns the exact same type of shoes as the footprints found in the mud.
Okay, solid evidence.
Right. And I present a witness who heard the defendant arguing with the victim a week ago. Every single one of those statements might be 100% factually true.
Yeah.
But if I conveniently leave out the fact that the defendant was at the scene because they were trying to perform CPR, or that 3 million other people own those same mass-produced shoes, the picture I've engineered is highly manipulative.
Exactly. You haven't lied. You haven't uttered a single false statement.
Yeah, but I have engineered a conclusion by depriving the jury of the full landscape of truth.
And by depriving them of that landscape, you are denying them the context required to make a sound, independent judgment.
Wow. Yeah, that makes perfect sense.
And this leads directly to the fundamental philosophical distinction between healthy persuasion and propaganda.
Because they aren't the same thing.
Not at all. Healthy persuasion approaches a listener and says, here are reasons. Here is the evidence. Situated within its proper context. Consider them.
It respects the listener.
Yes, it respects you as an autonomous, capable judge. It acknowledges your right to reflect, to feel uncertainty, to weigh competing values, and to evaluate independently.
It basically treats you like an adult. It assumes you have the intellectual capacity to handle the messiness of reality.
Right. But propaganda approaches you and says, here is the emotional frame through which you must view absolutely everything.
It's dictating the terms.
It doesn't treat you as a capable judge. It treats you as an object to be managed. It deliberately seeks to bypass your reflection and your independent evaluation. And it usually does this by triggering deep emotional responses like fear, disgust, or, tribal loyalty.
So the moral danger here is that it essentially interferes with intellectual autonomy.
Precisely.
Because if we think about what makes us human, we aren't just physical bodies taking up space. We are minds, we are decision makers, we have agency. So if an entity like a government, an algorithm, a political campaign is actively trying to bypass your reasoning, trying to hijack your emotional vulnerabilities so that you reach the conclusion they have pre-selected for you, they are fundamentally disrespecting your autonomy.
They are treating you like a programmable machine.
It's basically a violation of your personhood. It attacks the very faculties that allow you to participate in a free society.
Which brings us to the core tension of this entire deep dive.
Right.
We've established that propaganda attacks intellectual autonomy and manipulates agency. But does an attack on the mind equate to violence against the person?
See, this is where definitions get really tricky. Because if I manipulate you, I have wronged you. I might have even harmed you. But have I committed violence against you? I feel like we have to be very careful with our language here.
We do. And there are two distinct philosophical camps on this, starting with what's called the narrow definition of violence.
Okay, what does that entail?
Under this strict lens, violence is exclusively the intentional use of physical force against persons or property. Full stop.
So applying this standard, the answer to our central question is just a resounding no. Propaganda is not violence.
Correct. Under the narrow definition, a poster is not a gun. A speech is not a punch. A manipulated video does not physically imprison someone. The boundary is drawn strictly at the physical threshold.
Honestly, I am strongly inclined to defend that narrow definition.
Why is that?
Because if we start blurring those lines, if we start calling a mean tweet violence, or if we call aggressive corporate advertising violence, or even an unfair tax law violence, the word completely loses its precision.
That's a common concern, yeah.
Right. If every harmful or coercive act in society gets labeled as violence, then suddenly everything is violence. And if everything is violence, nothing is. We lose the specific language we desperately need to describe an actual physical attack.
It dilutes the impact of the word.
Exactly. If a political speech is categorized as violence, what word do we have left for a bombing?
That is the primary defense of the narrow definition, and it is a really vital one. Semantic inflation is dangerous. If the concept becomes too broad, it loses its descriptive and legal power. We need to be able to distinguish between a hateful editorial and a physical assault.
So what's the argument for the other side then?
Well, there is a compelling counter-argument found in the broader definition of violence. This perspective argues for the recognition of structural and psychological violence.
Structural violence.
Yes, it argues that limiting violence solely to physical force ignores the profound damage that can be inflicted on human beings through systemic means. It includes practices that seriously damage human beings, destroy their autonomy, create chronic fear, or normalize their domination.
So how does that actually look in practice? Because structural violence can sound a bit academic.
Let's ground it in an example. Imagine a sustained, relentless propaganda campaign targeting a specific minority population. Day after day, the state media, the billboards, the political speeches tell this group, you are dangerous, you are unwanted, you are a drain on our resources, your suffering does not matter.
Man, okay, putting myself in the shoes of someone in that minority group,
Yeah.
the narrow definition suddenly feels entirely inadequate.
Doesn't it?
Yeah, because the psychological and biological toll of that relentless messaging is catastrophic. You are experiencing constant public humiliation. You are living in a state of chronic hypervigilance.
Yeah.
You have lost all sense of security in your own neighborhood.
And it goes beyond just feeling bad.
Right. We know from neuroscience that chronic social exclusion and fear elevate cortisol levels. It damages the immune system. It literally shortens lifespans. The social environment itself has been weaponized against your biology. So even before a single physical blow is struck, you are being damaged.
Precisely. Through this broader lens, the social environment becomes the instrument of harm. The damage to the human being is real, it's measurable, and it's profound. The systems of society have been organized to degrade your existence.
So depending on which definition you subscribe to, the categorization totally shifts.
It does. But perhaps we don't need to completely collapse the categories into one another. We can recognize that propaganda is a severe moral violation, a form of profound psychological domination, without necessarily needing to classify it as a literal punch to the face.
I think that's a fair middle ground, but even if we agree that the propaganda itself isn't the physical punch, we cannot ignore that it is undeniably the thing that convinces someone else to throw the punch.
Right. It sets the stage.
Yeah, if propaganda isn't always the violence itself, how exactly does it manufacture the physical violence that almost always follows it historically? We have to look at the mechanics of that transition. How do you get from a hostile psychological environment to actual physical atrocities?
The bridge between propaganda and physical violence is dehumanization.
Dehumanization.
Yes, this is the most dangerous function of manipulative communication. Because human beings generally possess deeply ingrained moral inhibitions against harming other human beings. We are social creatures.
Right, we have evolutionary mechanisms that trigger empathy when we see another human in pain.
Exactly. So to get ordinary people to tolerate or actively participate in extreme cruelty, you cannot just order them to be cruel. You have to find a way to bypass those biological and moral inhibitions.
You essentially have to hack their empathy. You have to convince them that the targets aren't actually human, so the rules of human empathy just no longer apply.
That's exactly it. And there is a chillingly predictable methodological process to how dehumanization works in practice. It is not spontaneous, it's engineered. The framework we're looking at breaks this down into a 7-step progression.
7 steps. Okay, let's walk through them.
Step 1. You define a specific group as fundamentally different from the rest of society.
So you draw a hard boundary, creating this us versus them dynamic. You emphasize cultural differences or religious differences, economic differences. You make sure the dominant group sees the minority not as neighbors, but as the other.
Right, establishing the outgroup.
Yeah.
Then you move to step 2. You blame that newly defined group for the society's problems.
Okay, so if there is an economic downturn, it is their fault. If there is a rise in crime, it is their fault.
Exactly. You scapegoat them for the complex, often systemic issues that the society is facing at large.
So they are no longer just different. They are the active source of your pain and frustration.
Which sets the stage beautifully for step 3. Portraying them as actively dangerous. They aren't just a nuisance or a scapegoat anymore. They are an existential threat to your survival, to your culture, or to your children.
They're framed as invaders.
Invaders, a disease, predators, yes.
And this is where the neuroscience of fear really kicks in. Because when you convince a population that they are facing an existential threat, the amygdala takes over. The rational, empathetic parts of the brain are suppressed.
They're completely overridden. Which leads directly to step 4. The removal of empathy. If you genuinely believe someone is a dangerous threat causing your pain, you do not feel compassion for them.
No, your biological imperative is self-preservation. Empathy is shut down as a defense mechanism.
Once empathy is removed, you reach step 5,
Yeah.
normalizing exclusion. It becomes socially acceptable, even celebrated, to say they shouldn't be allowed in our shops, they shouldn't live in our neighborhoods, they shouldn't teach our children.
So the social contract is officially broken?
Broken and discarded.
Yeah.
The environment becomes incredibly hostile, but it is seen by the majority as a necessary hostility.
Wow. Which brings us to step 6, I imagine.
Yes. Step 6, justifying coercion. Society starts to demand that the state take action. The public accepts that this group needs to be forced to do things, restricted or rounded up for the quote-unquote safety and purity of the public.
And finally?
Finally, that brings you to step 7, tolerating or even enthusiastically participating in physical violence. The inhibitions are completely gone, the victims are no longer seen as human, so harming them does not violate the moral code against harming humans.
You have successfully manufactured the conditions for atrocities. Walking through that step-by-step breakdown is horrifying because you can look back through history, the Holocaust, Rwanda, the Balkans, and you can map that exact methodology onto those tragedies perfectly.
It follows the blueprint every time.
And the wartime context is the ultimate accelerator of this process, isn't it? When a government goes to war, the propaganda machine kicks into high gear. The state portrays its own side as entirely heroic, innocent, and acting purely out of necessary defense.
While the enemy is portrayed as uniformly evil, completely barbaric and irrational.
Yeah. And while some of that simplification is intended to maintain domestic morale or encourage civilian sacrifice, the terrifying side effect is that it makes extreme violence emotionally tolerable.
If enemy civilians cease to appear as ordinary human beings in the eyes of the public, if they are reduced to symbols of an evil regime, then dropping bombs on their neighborhoods becomes emotionally justifiable.
It's sickening.
It brings us to a profoundly dark moral realization from our source text. Wartime propaganda may not physically kill a single person, but it determines whose deaths count.
I want to pause on that phrase, whose deaths count. That is incredibly heavy because it exposes the deepest psychological manipulation of all. If the propaganda works, a society can look at a massive casualty count, thousands of children, civilians, and say, well, they weren't really like us anyway, it's unfortunate, but it was necessary.
It completely erodes the baseline value of a human life.
It alters the moral accounting of the entire society.
It creates a bifurcated morality.
Right.
There are those who are grievable and those who are ungrievable. The propaganda creates the cognitive framework that allows ordinary, otherwise decent people to sleep soundly while atrocities are committed in their name.
But, I want to challenge the causality here for a second.
Okay.
Because if we look at other things that cause violence, let's take alcohol, for example. Alcohol lowers inhibitions. It is a massive contributing factor in domestic abuse, in bar fights, in countless acts of violence. Weapons obviously facilitate violence, but we don't call a bottle of vodka violence. We don't call a gun sitting on a table violence. So isn't propaganda just the alcohol of social conflict? It lowers the moral inhibitions, sure, but it is not the act itself. The person who pulls the trigger is still responsible. Blaming the propaganda almost feels like a cop-out for human cruelty.
That is a very important distinction to make. Recognizing the power of propaganda does not absolve the individual of moral responsibility. But if we connect this to the broader systemic view, the thesis refines itself into this. Propaganda is an instrument of violence.
It's an instrument.
Yes, it is the moral preparation for the act rather than the physical act itself. A gun sitting on a table does nothing. But propaganda is not passive. It is an active, ongoing campaign to reshape reality. It builds the psychological infrastructure that the tanks eventually drive down.
That's a powerful image.
It is the solvent that dissolves the moral boundaries of a society so that violence can flow freely.
Okay, well, if propaganda is this incredibly potent instrument, this active tool for moral preparation, then the danger it poses has to depend heavily on who is wielding it, right? And what other tools they have in their societal toolbox. Because a political ad in my town is not the same as a state broadcast in a dictatorship.
Context dictates the severity of the danger. We absolutely have to look at different environments of control, starting with totalitarian systems.
Right.
In a highly authoritarian regime, propaganda rarely exists in a vacuum. It doesn't operate as a standalone communication strategy. It is paired with severe censorship, mass surveillance, repression, and the brutal punishment of any dissent.
So in that scenario, the citizen only hears one story everywhere they go. It's on the radio in the morning, it's in the newspaper, it's taught as fact in the classroom, it's the required perspective in the workplace.
There's no escape from it.
Alternative views don't just lose the public debate, they are actively erased from existence.
And expressing public disagreement becomes physically dangerous. You risk your livelihood, your freedom, or your life. In this context, propaganda ceases to be merely persuasion. It functions as a vital component of a political machinery of control.
It holds the whole thing together.
Exactly. The violence of the totalitarian system actually depends on the propaganda to provide a veneer of legitimacy, to ensure compliance, and to normalize the underlying terror. The physical violence and the psychological propaganda are locked in a symbiotic relationship.
Let's bring this closer to home, though. Most people listening to this deep dive do not live in totalitarian regimes.
No, they don't.
But democratic societies, massive corporations, political parties, super PACs, they all use selective narratives. They use intense emotional framing. They wrap themselves in patriotic symbolism, and they absolutely use fear-based messaging to get you to vote for them or buy their products.
They certainly do.
So, are we living in the same moral danger? Is a manipulative, fear-mongering political ad during a football game morally equivalent to a totalitarian state broadcast?
There is a crucial structural distinction here. While democracies absolutely utilize propaganda techniques and often very aggressively, the environment is fundamentally different. Democratic societies, structurally at least, allow for competing narratives. They allow for independent journalism, opposition parties, and public criticism.
So I might see a manipulative political ad, but I can also just open a new tab and read a journalist completely debunking it. Or I can listen to a counter-argument from a different politician. I have options.
Exactly. The danger of propaganda scales inversely with the availability of alternative perspectives. It becomes exponentially more dangerous when audiences lack realistic access to competing truths. A manipulative advertisement in an open media environment where you have the freedom to verify facts without fear of arrest is not the same as state propaganda backed by the threat of a secret police.
Right.
The monopoly on information is what makes the totalitarian version uniquely lethal.
That makes intuitive sense. The monopoly is the weapon. But what about situations where the power dynamic is inverted? Because resistance movements fighting against actual physical domination, they use propaganda too.
They do.
They use catchy slogans, highly simplified narratives, and emotionally powerful imagery to rally people to their cause.
Which introduces a really complex ethical dilemma. Does fighting for a just cause automatically make manipulation ethical?
Instinctually, a lot of people would say yes. If you are the underdog, if you are fighting an oppressive regime that has a massive military advantage, you have to fight fire with fire. If a simplified, highly emotional poster is what you need to recruit people to survive, maybe the manipulation is justified.
It is a tempting rationale, but we have to maintain moral consistency. A just cause does not make manipulation automatically ethical, because even a liberation movement can rely on lies. Even a resistance group can dehumanize their opponents and encourage blind, undiscerning hatred. If a resistance movement starts portraying all members of the dominant group, including civilians, as vermin to justify massacring them, the propaganda is still performing that dark work of dehumanization. The mechanism of harm is identical.
Wow, yeah. We cannot just judge the communication based on who's using it. We can't fall into the trap of saying, well, my side is doing it and our cause is righteous, so it's fine. We have to evaluate the propaganda by its methods, its truthfulness, and its actual effects on human empathy.
Though there is a sliding scale of morality here. Imagine a government during a defensive war. They are literally being invaded by a hostile foreign power. They run a massive public campaign encouraging citizens to remain calm, to conserve resources like food and fuel, and to resist the invading force.
Okay, that communication is undeniably going to be selective. It is going to be highly emotional. It is going to be drenched in patriotism and designed to unify the public through a single narrative.
But is it automatically morally corrupt? Perhaps not. The moral rot really begins to set in when the propaganda relies on deliberate deception, on dehumanizing the enemy to the point of justifying atrocities, on the manipulation of domestic terror, and the active suppression of verifiable truth. There are degrees of danger, and the intent and methods matter immensely.
We've looked at the macro environments, The totalitarian state, the noisy democracy, the resistance movement. I want to bring this right down to the microscopic level.
Okay.
Let's look at the modern mechanics of how this actually infects your daily life, your decision-making, and your view of your own neighbors.
Hmm.
How does the machinery of modern domination actually run on a psychological level?
It runs on a few very specific, highly refined engines. And the most powerful of those engines is fear.
Fear is primal. It bypasses the intellect completely.
It is deeply embedded in our evolutionary biology, and it radically alters human judgment. Propaganda leverages this by constantly broadcasting signals that tell you, you are under threat, your way of life is disappearing, enemies are everywhere, they are hidden among you, and they are coming for what you love.
Because when you are genuinely terrified, your brain is flooded with cortisol. Your fight or flight response is fully engaged. In that state, you are not thinking critically. You are not weighing statistical evidence. You are looking for a savior. You are looking for certainty.
Exactly. Under the influence of manufactured fear, populations become incredibly willing to surrender their own rights. They will voluntarily accept mass surveillance if they are told it will keep them safe.
They'll accept the censorship of their political opponent.
Yes, they will tolerate the discrimination of marginalized groups, the implementation of emergency powers, and eventually, state violence. The propaganda creates the emotional conditions in which coercion feels like a comforting embrace. It constructs a mental reality where extraordinary violence suddenly feels like a sad but absolute necessity.
And the way it solidifies that mental reality is through the second engine, repetition. It's the normalization pipeline. Because propaganda rarely relies on just one catastrophic message. It's the drip, drip, drip.
It's ubiquitous.
You hear a phrase in a political speech, then you read an op-ed using the same phrase, then it's a talking point on an evening panel show, then it's trending in the algorithmic feed on your phone, then your friends repeat it at a dinner party.
And that repetition moves the boundary of what is acceptable to say and think. We discussed the steps of dehumanization earlier, and repetition is how you lubricate that transition.
I see.
Yesterday, the repeated message was just, these people have different values. Today, through relentless repetition, the message morphs into, these people are actively dangerous to our values. And tomorrow, the message seamlessly becomes, something must be done about them.
It makes the unthinkable feel inevitable. But this brings us to the most urgent part of this discussion. We have to talk about the modern multiplier.
The digital age.
Yes, the digital age. Because all of these mechanics, fear, repetition, dehumanization, they have always existed. But modern technology has supercharged them in ways we are only just beginning to comprehend.
Dramatically supercharged. Digital systems have introduced capabilities that 20th century propagandists could only dream of. The architecture of persuasion has fundamentally changed.
Let me try an analogy here. In the old days, propaganda was like a giant billboard in the center of town. The state or the corporation put it up, and everyone walking through the town square saw the exact same message. You
Right.
could point at it, you could talk to your neighbor about it, you could debate it, critique it, or roll your eyes at it together. It was a shared piece of reality, even if it was manipulative. But today, propaganda is like a million invisible, customized sticky notes placed directly onto the retinas of individuals.
That captures the shift perfectly. The traditional broadcast model, one message sent to everyone, has been replaced by micro-targeted digital systems.
These platforms build unique data profiles on every individual.
Yes, they map your psychological tendencies. They know what angers you, they know what frightens you, they know what makes you click, and they algorithmically amplify that specific emotional content directly to you.
And because it's happening on my personal screen, I have absolutely no idea what sticky notes are being placed on your retina. I don't know what reality you are being fed.
And vice versa.
You and I could be sitting on the same couch. You might be scrolling through a feed that has curated a reality telling you the world is ending in fire, and my feed might be telling me the world is ending in ice. We are physically next to each other, but we are inhabiting completely different, highly customized psychological realities.
This phenomenon destroys what we might call the epistemic foundations of democracy.
Let's drill into that. We're talking about how we construct our shared knowledge.
Exactly. Democracy relies on voting, but more fundamentally, it relies on citizens sharing a basic access to reality. We have to agree on a basic set of facts, the baseline reality, in order to have a meaningful debate about what policies to enact.
If digital propaganda is constantly feeding us contradictory, personalized realities, if people can no longer distinguish verifiable fact from algorithmic fabrication, then we cannot form democratic judgments.
We can't debate tax policy or healthcare if we don't even agree on whether the sky is blue or whether a specific event actually happened yesterday.
Right. And because we don't know what others are seeing, public scrutiny of the propaganda becomes almost impossible. You cannot critique the billboard in the town square if the billboard is invisible to everyone except the person it is currently manipulating.
This invisible fracturing of our shared reality is a massive structural harm. It dissolves the social cohesion required for society to function peacefully.
Well, if this invisible, customized, fear-mongering manipulation is destroying our shared reality, the very natural, very human reaction is, why don't we just ban it?
Ban propaganda altogether.
Yeah, if propaganda is this existentially dangerous to our social fabric, shouldn't the government step in and censor it to protect society?
It is a profoundly tempting thought, especially when you understand how high the stakes are. But we must recognize the severe warning against this impulse. It introduces what is often called the censorship trap.
Right, because the moment you say we need to ban propaganda, the immediate, unavoidable follow-up question is, who gets to decide what counts as propaganda?
Who holds that incredible power over reality? Because historically, governments are very quick to label any legitimate criticism of their own policies as misinformation or extremism or propaganda.
Of course they do.
If you give the state the power to ban manipulative communication, you are almost always just handing them a tool to silence their political opponents.
The censorship intended to protect democracy literally transforms into just another weapon of propaganda. It's a snake eating its own tail. You try to protect freedom of thought by giving a centralized authority the power to dictate what you're allowed to read and see.
There might be strong legal grounds for regulating very specific, immediate harms like direct incitement to physical violence or coordinated deception in specific legal contexts like lying about voting dates or locations, but broad political censorship.
Like attempting to ban narratives or emotional framing.
Right. That risks undermining the very freedom of thought it claims to be protecting. We cannot save an open society by closing it.
But this brings up a really deep philosophical problem regarding manipulation versus coercion. Because if the government shouldn't ban it and I am left to navigate this invisible digital minefield myself, I have to ask.
Ask what?
If no one is putting a gun to my head, if no one is physically forcing me to believe a political narrative, and I honestly feel like I'm choosing my beliefs freely, am I really being coerced? If I read an article that makes me outraged and I independently decide to donate money to a cause or vote a certain way, I feel like I made a choice. Am I a victim of violence, or am I just participating in society?
This gets into the most profound aspects of psychological manipulation. Traditional coercion is blunt and obvious. It says, do this or I will inflict physical pain on you. It is a threat. You are acutely aware that you are being forced against your will.
It's very visible.
But manipulation operates on an entirely different axis. Manipulation does not remove your choices. It shapes what choices appear reasonable to you in the first place.
It's like rigging the menu before I even sit down at the restaurant. I think I'm choosing my meal freely, but you've already removed all the options you don't want me to see, and you've put a massive glowing spotlight on the one dish you want me to order.
That is exactly it. By controlling the information ecosystem you inhabit, by stoking your specific fears, by framing the narrative so that only one outcome seems moral or safe, the propagandist ensures that you will predictably choose the option they want.
Wow.
And the most insidious, brilliant, and terrifying part of successful propaganda is precisely what you just said. The manipulated person stands up, defends their position, and proudly says, I chose this freely. This is my independent conclusion.
That is chilling. The control is entirely invisible to the person being controlled. They will fight to defend the very ideas that were implanted in them.
It influences behavior and beliefs without ever openly removing choice. And this leads to a powerful synthesis of everything we've explored today. If we're trying to categorize propaganda ethically, perhaps the most accurate way to describe it is as a form of psychological domination. It isn't a physical chain, but it is an invisible tether on your capacity to reason.
Which brings us to the culmination of this entire deep dive. We set out to answer question 92. Is propaganda a form of violence? We've looked at the strict physical definitions and the broad definitions of structural harm. We've examined the dark bridge of dehumanization, the totalitarian context, the democratic echo chambers, and the terrifying personalization of the digital age.
We've debated whether a manipulated mind is a violated person.
And we arrive at a remarkably clear, if nuanced, conclusion. In the strict, literal, physical sense, propaganda is usually not violence. A word is not a bullet. An image is not an imprisonment. But propaganda is the machinery that makes violence possible.
It is the solvent that dissolves the moral boundaries of entire societies. It reshapes reality, it destroys empathy, and it systematically prepares ordinary people to accept or even commit unspeakable harm.
There is a line from the core concepts we discussed that I think serves as the perfect anchor. It distills this entire philosophical journey into 2 sentences. A weapon can injure a body. Propaganda can help decide which body society becomes willing to injure.
The power to decide whose suffering matters is the ultimate power over life and death.
It really is. And for you, listening to this, navigating a world where a million customized digital sticky notes are trying to bypass your reasoning and hijack your emotions every single day, I want to leave you with a final thought to mull over.
It's an important one.
We've seen how propaganda thrives on fear. We've seen how it thrives by isolating us in these customized digital echo chambers, feeding us personalized realities and telling us exactly who we are supposed to despise and who we are supposed to fear. Which means perhaps the most radical act of self-defense you can practice, the very best way to protect your own intellectual autonomy, isn't just fact-checking articles online.
Because facts can be manipulated too.
Exactly. Maybe the most radical act is actively seeking out and intentionally empathizing with the exact perspectives you are currently being instructed to despise. Because if propaganda is the machinery that builds walls between human beings, deep, relentless curiosity might just be the only tool that can tear them down. Keep questioning the narratives around you, stay curious, and thanks for joining us on this deep dive.